The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. Welcome to the ILSO Advisor webinar, Why Plant Health is More Than Just Disease, brought to you by BASF and the Illinois Soybean Checkoff. I'm Todd Steinacher, and I'll be moderating the webinar this morning. Just as a few housekeeping items to start with, if you included your CCA number when you register for this webinar and you stay with us for the entire presentation, your number will automatically be submitted for one CEU in crop management. If you are listening to a recording of this webinar, you will need to go to Certified Crop Advisor website, log into your account, and self-report the credits. You can ask questions during the webinar by using your chat features on the dashboard on the right side of your screen. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Without further delay, we'd like to introduce today's presenter, Mike Prups. Mike is a technical service representative for BASF, and he earned his bachelor's degree in crop science from the University of Illinois in 2015. He followed that by receiving his master's degree in crop science, with a concentration in weed science from Michigan State University in 2018. In his current role, Mike serves as a technical expert for BASF products in southern half of Illinois. He also manages research trials, both agronomic and product related, and at the BASF Midwest Research Farm in Seymour, Illinois. The screen is now yours. Mike, take it away.
All right, thank you for that. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining in here today. So today we're going to be talking about crop plant health, and we're going to be discussing why that goes beyond just disease and disease control. So we'll just go ahead and jump right into it. So I think we first need to answer the question right now, or to start this, of what is plant health? So over the past several years, plant health has become a common term that's been thrown around when talking about fungicide, but just left by itself, plant health can actually be a very vague term. So when a company is referring to their fungicides and saying it offers plant health, it's often hard to know what they're actually referring to. For most fungicides, plant health is going to mean basically just disease control. But as we're going to talk about today, that is going to go true plant health goes a little further than just disease control. It is an important aspect of plant health, and you can see over here on the right that is included in our overall plant health. But there's another aspect of plant health that needs to be addressed as well, and that's environmental stress. And that's what we've got over here on the right. So, like I said, diseases are important. They are part of plant health, and that is something that we're going to cover today, but they're not necessarily the whole picture that we need to talk about. So one thing you'll notice as I go along in this presentation is that I'll tend to relate crop plant health to human health, in that just like humans and crops, our health is not necessarily only determined by whether we are currently sick or not, or have a disease or not. There's a lot more that goes into our health as well. For an example would be, mental health. So with crops, it's kind of the same thing. Just because they don't have a disease doesn't mean they're necessarily fully healthy, or that's not the end of the story in terms of health. We also have this other factor, and that's environmental stress. So when I break down plant health, those are the two aspects that I tend to think of. We've got disease, and then we've got environmental stress and how those plants are able to manage that environmental stress. So if you have a true plant health fungicide, we're going to have the option to control those diseases and also mitigate or control how these plants respond to these environmental stresses. And when you combine both of those together, you get the full plant health picture, and then you can increase your crop growth efficiency, and that is eventually going to lead to an increase in yield, which is the overall goal. So to start this off, we are first going to talk about disease, break down some disease characteristics, things like that, and gain an understanding. So I'll pose the question to the audience, for everybody that's out there right now. How important is disease control to you in terms of your soybean plans and how you go about protecting your soybean crop? You got a few options here of not so important all the way to very important, and there should be an option for you to fill out a poll. And while I'm waiting for you all to fill that out, we'll talk a little bit about some of the common diseases that we see, especially in Illinois, or maybe some of the most problematic ones that we come across. So The first one you see here on the screen, that's Cercospora leaf blight. This one is relatively common in certain areas. It's typically not one that we think of as very yield limiting for the most part. This is one that's going to start showing up at the top of the plant. It almost has a bit of a sunburn kind of look to it. Most of the time when we do see Cercospora in the field, it's a relatively low level of infection. Usually not too worried about yield loss resulting from that, but it can get in situations where it can be a little tougher. The next one you see here, that's target spot. Target spot is primarily more of a problem the further south you get, especially in the southern U.S. It's a driver disease for them. We do see it sneak up into southern Illinois a little bit, usually also not to a yield limiting factor, but still can raise some concerns. It actually gets its name very truly that if you can see the lesions on there, it actually looks like a target. It's got some concentric circles coming out of there. And then finally, I think what we can probably agree is the most problematic soybean disease that we face in Illinois, especially the further south you get in Illinois, and that's frog eye leaf spot. This is a disease that can get out of hand pretty quickly, can definitely be yield limiting, especially if you get some very severe infections. And probably the biggest problem is that it's starting to develop resistance to some of our strobilurin fungicides, which we'll cover that in a little bit. So keep that in mind if you do have frog eye leaf spot, that it may be strobilurin resistant. You may need to adjust how you're going about managing those as well. But primarily frog eye, again, is going to be a bigger problem in the southern half of the state. But it is starting to creep its way north a little bit into the northern Illinois. We are finding it there as well. A couple other diseases that I didn't put up here but I think are worth mentioning. We've also got septoria. Septoria is probably one of the most common diseases that we see. It's that yellowing that you see in the lower canopy. It's pretty common, usually, again, not yield limiting except for when we get some severe infections and things like that. And finally, we've also got white mold. White mold is probably going to be pretty limited to the northern half of the state, but it is definitely something that growers up there have to keep in mind and manage for. I think we got some answers still coming in here, and here before too long we should be able to see what the results are or what your feedback is. Okay, I'm not sure if you guys can see the results. I think we're having a little bit of technical issues, but we'll continue on here. So when we talk about disease control and kind of importance, I'm sure there's going to be varying levels of what we would expect to see in terms of how important disease control is to certain growers. It's probably going to depend a lot on where you are in the state, how heavy a disease pressure you can get, but it definitely is something that we need to keep in mind moving forward or when you're planning for your soybean crop. Okay, I did get some feedback here. 48% of people thought disease control was important, so that's good. Good that we see that is an important decision maker for how we're handling our fungicide. So we'll move on here. So yeah, disease control, yeah, it is very important, obviously. So it's something that we for sure want to keep in mind. Disease control can often be a hard conversation to have because diseases are often hard to visualize, especially when we're controlling them, because you don't necessarily see a disease die or anything like that. So I'd often like to show, or I like to equate it to weed control. Weed control is very visual. You see a weed, it comes up, you go out and you spray it, and you see the weed die. That's very visual. That's what we like to see. So I often like to equate disease control to that, except you just don't have that same visual aspect. But diseases and weeds, they often behave very similarly. So just like you saw all those weeds in that field, that's going to have an impact on your yield. Here you've got this pretty severe infection of frog eye leaf spot that can also have an impact on your yield as well. So you've got both weeds and diseases. They're going to affect that crop very negatively by stealing away its resources. Weeds are going to steal away nutrients, water, sunlight, things like that. On the other hand, diseases are going to steal away energy resources that are already within that plant. And they're also going to affect the plant's ability to photosynthesize by causing leaf tissue death, things like that. So some different routes on how they affect our plants, but all in all, it's all going to lead to the same thing, that if you're influencing that plant negatively, taking away its resources, its energy, or its ability to create resources, that's all going to lead to a decrease in yield. So beyond just yield, this is something that we also have to keep in mind is how our seed quality could also be impacted. Not necessarily every time we do get disease is our seed quality impacted, but there are certain instances where we've seen it be a pretty substantial issue. An example of that was 2018, where we had some late season diseases come in. We had insects feeding on pods that opened the door for infections to occur. And then following that, we had a lot of issues with seed quality. That can be especially devastating when growing seed beans for planting the next year, influencing the quality of those beans, the ability for them to germinate and emerge, and things like that. So some examples of that would also be Stomata seed decay that you can see here, or purple seed stain. Anything that's affecting that seed quality is something that we're also going to want to make sure we are avoiding. So just how impactful can disease be? This is the one slide that I'll share with you guys. It's actually referring to yield, but I think it's a pretty telling story. This is 2 years worth of studies that we've actually done in Southern Illinois with Southern Illinois University in an area where they have traditionally had very heavy frog eye leaf spot pressure. Other than that, in this area, they had irrigation. It was heavily fertilized. So we tried to eliminate any other factors as much as possible and basically break it down to just that disease control aspect. And you can see that in a couple of years with a few different fungicides out there, we had some pretty significant responses. In 2018, we had six bushel, almost up to 9 bushel responses. And then in 2019, again, we had up to about a 6 bushel response there. And when we think about soybean yield, the numbers might not be as staggering in response as they are in corn, but when you've got soybean prices that are $9 per bushel, things like that, a 6 bushel response can be pretty significant. So we know that diseases can be very impactful, and luckily, based on the feedback that we got, we're all pretty aware of that and want to make sure that we're trying to control diseases as much as possible. So I'm going to go into a little bit of a science lesson. I think it's important to understand some of these diseases, kind of the biology of them a little bit. And I think by understanding them, we can better understand how we can go about controlling those diseases as well. So the first thing I want to cover is signs versus symptoms. So a sign of a disease is actual physical evidence of that pathogen being present. So an example of that would be fungal hyphae. You can see this picture over here on the left. We've got some powdery mildew showing up, and that is actually disease structures that we can see physically there on the plant. Another example would be rust pustules. Those are actual structures of the disease as well instead of lesions. And then this is actually a pretty cool picture that we have within BASF. We can actually see this is a cross-section of a leaf with actively growing disease hyphae going through that. This was taken with an electron microscope, so it's not something you're going to be able to see with the naked eye or anything like that, but it is still an actual structure. So when we compare that to symptoms, symptom is actually a result or reaction to infection. So this is most likely the stuff that we're going to see in the field more often than not. Examples of that include lesions. So you've got these frog eye leaf spot lesions over here. Those aren't actual signs. Those aren't actual disease structures, but they are a result of that infection occurring. Another example would be crops wilting from some sort of soil-borne root infection, things like that, where they are dying off. That's not the actual disease that you're seeing, but you are seeing a result. So again, like I said earlier, this is also going to be similar to us as humans, that when we get sick, we never actually see that pathogen. But what we do see and what we do feel are symptoms of that pathogen infecting our bodies. So that's things such as fever, coughing, sneezing, etc. So just like us, plants, we do have some differences in terms of what we're seeing versus what we aren't seeing. So another thing that I think is really important to understand when we're talking about diseases is understanding what the latent period is. The latent period is the time between infection and the appearance of actual symptoms. So many diseases have a pretty significantly long latent period that between that time, infection has actually occurred, but we really have no way of knowing that because we haven't seen those symptoms show up yet. An example of that would be frog eye leaf spot. It has a latent period of 7 to 10 days. So when that frog eye leaf spot infects our soybean field, it's going to be 7 to 10 days before we ever even see that first lesion that tells us, hey, we've got an infection out here and potentially need to look into some options to control it. And that can kind of put us behind the 8 ball a little bit. So I've got a little animation on what that looks like. So we've got this picture of our nice healthy soybean field and what I imagine a frog eye leaf spot spore looking like, and it's floating over here infecting our soybeans. And then after that, we can add 7 to 10 days, and then we get these first lesions start to show up that tells us we have a problem. The issue with this is that by the time we find out that issue is or that infection has already got a 7 to 10 day head start on us. So we're already a little bit behind the 8 ball, and we need to make sure we know what types of fungicides are going to be effective in controlling a disease that's already there, or if we're going out prior to infection, we got to make sure we have a fungicide that's going to provide us some sort of preventative or residual control that stops infection from occurring in the first place. So this is going to be pretty general. We do have some fungicides tend to be broken down into strobilurins that provide preventative for the most part. So we'll look at those. Here we've got some of the most common ones from pyraclostrobin and azoxystrobin and a few other ones here. These are the ones that we're going to find most likely in our common corn and soybean fungicide premixes. For the most part, strobilurins are really good at providing preventative disease control. So we like to get those on prior to infection occurring and stopping that infection. It's similar to putting down a residual herbicide and preventing weed emergence. It's kind of the same concept. When it comes to diseases that have already infected and are established, that's where strobilurins tend to struggle a little bit, and they don't have that same ability to control diseases that are already there. But luckily, we do have triazole fungicides. These are kind of the opposite of strobilurin fungicides in that they are really good at controlling diseases that have already been established. So, for example, like in that last slide when we talked about seeing those lesions and realizing that we do have an established infection, that's where you want to make sure that you do have a triazole in there for some curative control. And here we've got some good examples of those as well. The good thing is that most of our fungicide premixes, for the most part, consist of a strobilurin component and a triazole component. So it does round them out pretty well in terms of disease control by adding that preventative and curative option. But some are better at controlling certain diseases than others, so that's important to keep in mind. And then we've had the SDHI fungicides as well. They're a little bit more of a mixed bag, I guess is the right way to put it. Not necessarily a hard and fast rule on what they're good at and what they're not good at. Some of them are curative. Some of them do offer some preventative control, but most of them are usually specifically targeted at controlling one specific disease. An example of that would be benzoflumpir. That's the bottom one here. That's the rust specialist that you find in Tribopro. It makes it really good at controlling southern rust in corn, things like that. You've got fluxapyroxate, which is a component of BASF's Preaxor fungicide. That is an excellent component for controlling target spot. So they tend to be a little bit more of a mixed bag in terms of what they bring to the table or have to offer. And then we've got a couple exceptions to the rule, those being mefentrifluconazole, that is the new active ingredient in BASF's Revysol fungicide. And then you've got flutriazole, which is more commonly referred to as Top Guard. Both of those are triazoles, but they are pretty unique compared to other triazoles in that they offer both preventative and curative disease control. So it's important to understand what products you're using, what they offer in terms of, disease control, preventative, curative, things like that. But it's also important to know what diseases those are good at controlling. So like I said earlier, certain fungicides are better at controlling certain diseases than others are. So if you have a specific disease that you're worried about or have had trouble with in the past, it's always a good idea to make sure that you're learning what the fungicides you're using are good at controlling. So let's talk about a few methods of disease control. The first one being mechanical control, and primarily what we're looking at here is some fall tillage there to make sure that we are tilling under any residue that has disease structures on it. So a lot of them will have overwintering structures that hopefully allow them, or in their minds, hopefully allows them to control or to stay viable until the next year. But we can see that tillage, by tilling that under and getting some decomposition of that residue, will also break down some of those overwintering structures. So we have cultural control, which is very important. You can choose resistant soybean varieties for specific diseases that you're worried about. You can plant wider rows to get greater airflow down those rows, prevent moisture from building up, keep a drier environment that's going to be less conducive for diseases to infect. And then you can also look into crop rotation. Crop rotation is probably going to be good for only specific diseases. A lot of times we can get spores that stay around or that they can flow from one field to another, but there are certain instances where crop rotation can be very beneficial. And then finally, we've got chemical control, and that's going to be the fungicide aspect of it. So a good disease control program is going to keep all of these in mind as options. You may be limited on what you can and can't do. Maybe your tillage isn't an option, but just make sure that you're taking an integrated approach to controlling these diseases and not relying on just one single aspect of disease control. So that's all I have specifically for disease control. As we move forward, we're going to focus on the other aspect, which is plant health that I mentioned earlier, and we're going to really dive into this fungicide portion and what a plant health fungicide can bring beyond just that disease control. So we're getting into part 2 now, and that is environmental stress and getting an understanding of how that impacts our soybeans and what we can do to help our crops handle these stresses. So we'll try an audience question again. The question I'd like to ask is, how many soybean acres are treated with a fungicide on your own specific operations? So we've got anywhere from 25% or less, and then we kind of incrementally build up all the way up to 100%. So we should have some poll options open up here for you guys to get some feedback. Hopefully we can make this work. The reason I ask this question is a lot of times we run into conversations with growers who tend to prioritize where they're placing fungicides. A lot of times it could be on maybe just high yielding areas or high yielding fields. They may save that for those fields. A lot of times it could be in relation to where they have had disease pressure higher in the past. It could be based on your seed decisions and which ones have a naturally higher tolerance to diseases. So there's a lot of potential decisions that can go into this. But as we kind of move forward, what you'll hopefully begin to understand is that disease is maybe not the only thing that should be driving your fungicide decisions. We also have environmental stress that's going to impact pretty much any field that you could probably think of in some way or another. And I'm not saying that it's going to be severe or something that you're going to run into every time, but for the most part, environmental stress is something that shows up year in and year out to varying levels. And it's going to show up pretty much in any field that you can possibly think of. So it's going to add another factor into the decision-making process. of whether you're using a fungicide, what types of fungicide you're using to try to mitigate that environmental stress, and how it's being handled. So let's see. We got some poll results that came back in. Unfortunately, I don't think you guys can see it, but I'll read them off to you here. 25% or less on the, or sorry, 25% or less, 23% responded on that one. 25 to 50%, so option B, 35% said that. 16% said they treat 50 to 75% of their acres. And then, let's see, 16% said they treat 75% or greater. And then finally, at 10%, treat 100% of their acres. So we got a pretty wide variety across the board here in terms of our treatments and things like that. So obviously, that's going to be some different preferences, things like that. But as we move forward and gain a better understanding of environmental stress and how that can impact our crops, we may be potentially adjusting how we make those decisions. So let's talk about where we can get some of these stresses from. We can get it from insect feeding. Obviously, that's going to have an impact on our crops in terms of just defoliation, but also in terms of causing stress. But there's also several other sources of stress. Can be some more extreme than others, but they're all going to impact the crop's performance at some level. So we could have excess moisture. We could have extreme heat. Drought is a pretty important one as well. And then finally, we could get some severe weather events, something like hail impacting our crops. These are all abiotic stresses. So these are not living. This is just something that is part of the environment. But it's all going to have an impact, just like humans. We don't like to be stressed, and a lot of these things would stress us out, and they stress our crops out. And just like humans, we don't perform at our peak level when we are stressed. Luckily, we can find ways to avoid stress. For example, if it's too hot, we can go find something. We can go find some shade to sit under. If things are too dry, we can go get a drink. Unfortunately, for soybeans, they don't have the ability to avoid stress. They can't get up and run away. They can't hide from a hailstorm. They can't hide under a shade tree when it's hot outside. They're stuck where they are. But there are ways that we can help them mitigate the impact that stress has. So it's not necessarily preventing stress, but it's helping these plants and how they respond in the presence of stress. So I'll throw one more audience question up for you guys before we really dive into what these stresses are and how they specifically impact our crops. So this is more of just to see what you guys think here. On average, how many flowers do you think are aborted on a soybean plant every year? So we've got 0 to 20%, 20 to 35%, 30 to 5 to 60%, or D, 60 to 75%. So really wondering just what it is that, in terms of stress and response, on average, how often or how many of these flowers were lost by these soybean plants. So anytime we lose flowers, obviously that's not a good thing, because our flowers, that's what we get pollination from. That's where we get seeds resulting from. So this number is going to vary in terms of, the stresses that we're facing, how impactful that stress is, how severe it is. But all in all, we want to make sure that we are avoiding that as much as possible. So we'll wait a little bit longer to see if we can get some results to come in here. I think you'll be a little surprised by what the answer is, and how some of our other yield factors can be impacted by stress, and how important it is to make sure we keep that in mind as we're moving forward in terms of preventing stress. So here we go. We got a poll result in. Let's see. Nobody responded, or a 0% response to A, so that's good. 27% think that we lose option B, 20 to 35% of our flowers. 37% of people think that we lose option C, 35 to 60%. And then finally, 37% also think that we lose option D, 60 to 75% of our flowers. So let's see what that actual answer is. 37% of you are correct. It is. Normally, we lose about 60 to 75% of our flowers. So if you think about that, that's up to 3/4 of the flowering potential that a soybean plant has every year that we never even see because those flowers are aborted. It could be due to a variety of different reasons, stress that they face, lack of nutrients. But basically, that soybean made a decision on 3/4 of those flowers that it just didn't have enough resources to support that much seed. So if we can help lower that number, that's just that much more yield that we're going to be protecting. We can also see some different instances of how stress can impact crops at different stages as well. So when we get to the R4 growth stage, if we have moisture stress or temperatures above 95 degrees, we found that you can reduce the total pod number per plant. If we start to decrease pod numbers, we obviously start to lose yield. And then at R6, which is also a pretty important stage, if we start to get too dry there, we can start to reduce seed size as well. So a lot of different areas in this plant's life and our soybean's life where we can have stress impact the crop. So let's learn about how we can actually prevent that. So what specifically happens when we have stress on our crops? So we've got stress over here, and when I have this conversation with people, I typically break it down into 3 different impacts that environmental stress actually has. The first thing is that we see an increase in ethylene production. The second thing we see is our stomata on our leaves start to close. And then finally, the third aspect is that we get reactive oxidative species. I'm going to break down each one of these in a little bit more detail moving forward. But the important thing to keep in mind is that if you get one of these or all 3 of these as a result of stress, they can all lead to the same result, and that is decreased yield potential. So we are protecting our yield potential here by using a plant health fungicide. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. First of all, let's talk about ethylene production and what ethylene does. So ethylene is a hormone that is naturally produced within the plant. At the right time, ethylene is a really good thing because it's actually what causes plant tissue to senesce and die at the end of the year. So when we want our crops to dry down in preparation for harvest, ethylene is what's actually causing that. So at the right time, it's a really good thing. But the problem is that a plant's natural reaction to stress is to produce this ethylene hormone. And if we get it started producing at the wrong time, now we can start to have an impact on our yield. So we do get that ethylene that's starting to cause that tissue to die. The crop responds this way because its single and foremost goal is to produce seed. So if they start to detect stress, what they basically decide to do is that they're going to start shutting down and conserve energy so that they can at least produce some seed. They're going to cut their losses. They don't think they have enough resources to produce a lot of seed. So they just want to make sure that they actually produce just something. We want to help them avoid that. So we try to get in the way and try to trick this plant basically into not producing ethylene. Outside of that, we can also, outside of the tissue shutting down and the dying off, we can also have some direct effects on grain production, depending on when that stress timing is. I mentioned a few of those a little bit ago, but we can lead to aborted flowers. You can lead to less seeds per pod or pods per plant. It can also lead to a decreased seed weight. This is all because the plant is worried about not having enough energy or resources, and it's going to try to cut its losses. But the good thing is, with a plant health fungicide, we can alter how the crop responds to stress and inhibit this ethylene production. So basically, if you use a true plant health fungicide, what's going to happen is it's going to kind of trick that plant into ignoring the stress that's going on around it. So it can't get rid of the stress or the cause of the stress, but we're kind of controlling how the plant reacts to that by stopping this ethylene production. If we can stop the ethylene production, we can stop that tissue from dying down. We can stop how it impacts those direct factors for yield as well. And that's going to be pretty important in allowing the plant to continue doing what we want it to do, which is photosynthesizing, producing energy, and eventually producing yield. So we've got a pretty cool graph here. Like I said in the last slide, these plant health fungicides are going to help that plant ignore the stress by reducing ethylene production. So what we've got in this graph is actually 4 different strobilurin fungicides and how they were able to inhibit or stop this ethylene production within the crop. In this case, we applied these fungicides to some wheat, and then they were stressed 10 days later with excessive heat. So when we look at this graph, the higher the bar, the better we were at preventing ethylene production and stopping that stress from having an impact. So you can see over here on the left, 3 hours after the stress was induced, we see, like, for example, with BASF headline, we've got over 50% of our ethylene was inhibited or stopped it from being produced. Kind of like I said earlier, not all fungicides are created equal in terms of how they perform in disease control or in terms of how they affect the ethylene production as well. You see that some of them weren't able to inhibit ethylene production as much as the headline was, and then you actually can see that one of them, Quadris, actually increased by this negative. We're looking at ethylene inhibition, so a negative number means that we actually had more ethylene was produced over here. And we'll talk about why that is in a couple of minutes, but just keep that in mind. So another thing that happens when we get ethylene production in response to stress is that we cause the stomata on the leaf to close. And this is another response to stress. This plants do this in order to try to conserve what resources and water it has available. Basically, what the stomata do is, they have a lot of different important roles in how the plant grows. They regulate the intake and output of gases. They're going to allow for evapotranspiration, and they're going to regulate the temperature of the plant as well. So to try to put it in layman's terms, it's kind of like they are the ventilation system of the plant. They're the water flow meter, and they're also the thermostat for the plant. So if the stomata are closed, what happens is, first of all, you don't get any exchange of gases, which means that you can't have photosynthesis occurring. And if you don't have photosynthesis occurring, the plant's not going to be able to produce yield or produce energy that's eventually going to lead to yield. Also, if the stomata are closed, don't have any way to regulate the temperature within the plant. And just like humans, just like us, we don't like to be hot. So if we're in a situation where it's too hot, we're not going to be happy. So when the stomata are forced to close from stress, we don't have any way to regulate that temperature anymore. So what I like to tell people is that if you're in a situation, for the example, these soybeans is, if they're in a hot environment and they're stressed and these stomata close, it's kind of similar to rolling up the windows of your car on a hot summer day, but unfortunately you don't have any air conditioning in there either. So you're going to be pretty uncomfortable, you're going to be pretty unhappy, and just like us, the plants aren't going to like that either. Luckily, we do have plant health fungicides that do inhibit that ethylene production. So if we get ethylene production stopped, we're also not going to see that stomata close, and those plants are going to be able to continue to photosynthesize and regulate temperature even when stress has occurred. So it's kind of cool. We can actually visualize this, not with our own two eyes, but we do have some technology that allows us to actually see these differences in response to stress. So this was an example of a soybean field in Kentucky that was sprayed with two different fungicides. Over here on the left, we've got BASF's Reactive fungicide that does offer these plant health benefits. And we see that the temperature within that canopy is quite a bit cooler than the Quadris top over here on the right, or on the left, my apologies. So this kind of goes back to that ethylene slide that I showed earlier, where we saw the Quadris actually showed an increase in ethylene production. And the reason for that is that Quadris and any of the fungicides that's a component of actually causes the stomata to close on the plant versus keeping them open. The reason for that is to try to conserve water within the plant so it doesn't get lost through evapotranspiration in the case of a drought. But the problem with that is that, as we learned in the last slide, by closing those stomata and not having any exchange of gases or not being able to regulate the temperature, you're going to block that ethylene gas from being able to escape within the plant. The temperature is going to build up, that ethylene gas is going to build up. We're going to have a bit of a chain reaction in terms of how that plant is going to actually continue to be stressed, a little bit of a cyclical thing. So here we have another example on the right. This is a cornfield, but we do have a BASF plant health product that's applied on the right versus nothing applied on the left. And again, we do see that cooler temperature showing up in there. So this was actually an example in North Dakota where the products were applied, and then there was a drought about 2 weeks prior to these pictures being taken, and we were still able to see the effects of that plant health application keeping that canopy cooler. So basically, the reaction or the timeline that we have is by applying these plant health fungicides, we do get ethylene suppression, and then following that, we keep our stomata open. And if we keep our stomata open, we keep a cooler canopy, which the plants are obviously going to like. And if the plants are happy, we get increased growth efficiency, which is going to lead to an increased yield, or protecting that yield potential that we already have. And then the last aspect of plant health that I like to talk about is these reactive oxidative species. So this is a little bit tough to explain, but basically I like to think about these reactive oxidative species as these little evil guys that we have over here on the left that like nothing to do but just to tear things up and destroy the cells and stuff in the plant. So they can tear up DNA, they can tear up plant proteins, and eventually lead to cell death. And trying to fight off these ROS, we've got antioxidants. So we got our little good guy superheroes over here as well, trying to fight them off. So this is always going on within the plants. And usually there's enough antioxidants to fight off these reactive oxygen species. But unfortunately, when we get a stress situation, these can actually be increased to levels that the antioxidants are no longer able to control. But luckily, plant health Hey everybody, sorry about that. My phone actually just dropped off, lost the call. So hopefully you all can hear me now. Can I get some confirmation on the chat? Yes, okay.
We got you back.
Sorry about that, buddy. Sounds like I'm back. So hopefully we can avoid that from happening again. So I'll continue on with talking about basically these plant health fungicides that we have can actually increase antioxidants to fight the levels of ROS that get increased when we have stress. So we are actually able to see this as well. We were able to conduct some experiments where we put a chemical on some corn plants that actually does the same thing that causes this oxidative stress, and then how different fungicides were able to handle that. So we have our untreated, we've got a couple of other fungicides here, Delaro and Trivapro, and you can see they don't look all that different in response to this oxidative stress. But when we look at headline ant fungicide that does provide plant health, we can see that there's a pretty drastic difference in how that crop was able to withstand the oxidative stress. So again, this is just another visual way that we can see this stress being handled, stress being mitigated, and basically our yield being protected. So those are the three aspects that I talk about usually when I'm referring to plant health, and what that can, how that can impact your crops, and how using plant health fungicide can benefit you. So let's talk a little bit to wrap this up about how to utilize a plant health fungicide. So if you do want a tree plant health fungicide, it's going to have to bring, aspects of both disease control and mitigating that environmental stress. So a disease, a fungicide at its base level, it should always offer disease control. That's what it's here for. If it didn't have disease control, it wouldn't have a place in agriculture. But now you know that there are options out there that can offer more than just disease control, and they can also help the crop manage non-disease stresses that are going to happen all the time. So things like we talked about heat, drought, or some severe weather events. And just remember, these crops don't have the ability to run away from stress, and they can lead to yield loss in multiple different ways. So the only way to make sure we're protecting against all of these different factors is to make sure we're utilizing a true plant health product. So I've got a few examples of some BASF plant health fungicides and how you can tell if you are actually utilizing a true plant health fungicide. So we've got Preaxor, we've got Beltima, and we've got Reactive here. Those are BASF 3 primary soybean fungicides, and you can see that at the top of all those labels, they say for disease control and plant health. So we do have plant health in there, but luckily, when we look further into the label, we can actually specify what that plant health is referring to. So if you're using a fungicide that, again, has this plant health claim at the top, look through the rest of that label to see if they actually go into a further explanation or if they're just equating plant health to disease control. So all BASF plant health fungicides, for example, they're powered by our F500 technology. This was brought out in the mid-2000s with our headline fungicide, and it's going to be in all of our plant health fungicides moving forward. So we don't just claim plant health. We actually detail within that label how it is that we offer that. And the only way we were actually able to get that is we had to go through some pretty extensive testing that proves that we offer plant health benefits that go beyond just disease control. So if you see your label and at the top it claims plant health, but then look further on and there's no explanation offered as to what that actually means, it's most likely just equating plant health to disease control. So my challenge to everybody here is to look at the labels of the products that they're using and find out what it is they actually mean when they say plant health. And finally, I think we need to look at what plant health actually looks like. So this is something that we often can't see very well because these are physiological effects that are going on at the cellular level of the plant. But we did have some visual examples earlier, such as the canopy temperature and the oxidative stress. But I like this one because it's an actual field-based example of what plant health can do. Now, I know that we're looking at a cornfield picture, and this is an Illinois Soybean Association event, but I think you'll appreciate what this has to look like here. So this was an example. This was a few years ago of a severe hail event on June 7th. And 3 days later, they went out with Preaxor that, like we learned on the last slide, does offer plant health. They sprayed it in strips through this field. And then a month later, they came back and took pictures just to see the effects. And here we've got two different pictures within that field, side by side, of Preaxor versus the untreated. And you can see just how much better this crop was able to handle the stress of that hail event. Now, all of them were able to, for the most part, continue growing and living, but you do see a pretty significant difference in both of these pictures that the plants that got Preaxor sprayed on them, they're off to a much better start than the untreated because they were just able to handle and respond to that stress in a much better fashion. Other ways that we can view this is through some overhead imagery, like the two on the top. We use NDVI imagery that basically measures the amount of green, healthy tissue that's still remaining out there. That's going to be driving yield and things like that. We can also see it at the end of the year, such as with the picture that we have down here with a plant health fungicide versus an untreated, still maintaining that green leaf tissue that's going to continue photosynthesizing, adding grain weight, and driving our yield. So there are ways that we can see the effects of a plant health fungicide, but sometimes we have to get a little creative. So with that, that's all I have for you guys. I'd like to thank you all for joining in today. I hope this was helpful and informative. I want to thank the Illinois Soybean Association for asking me to join on here as well. We do have some materials for everybody to download. It's on your dashboard on the right. There should be an option to download some materials as well. And I think with that, we're going to open it up with some questions. Todd?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. First question is, as relates to controlling frog eye in southern Illinois with the high humidity, seems like it'll likely pay. What's your thoughts on treatments throughout the rest of the state, maybe where the humidity is not quite as severe?
In terms of treatments throughout the rest of the state, if you're not fighting as much pressure, you probably don't need to have. You can probably adjust your fungicide options if you're not having the high disease pressure. So, for example, if you're in northern Illinois and don't fight disease nearly as much, you may not need a fungicide that is so focused on controlling frog eye leaf spot, but you also can have other issues such as the stresses that we talked about. So Not necessarily a lack of need for a fungicide, but maybe you can adjust the fungicide that you're using and how you're going to get a response from that.
Okay, thank you. The next question revolves around applying fungicides will potentially kill the beneficial fungi species also. What's your concerns, or how do you handle this?
So I'm usually not too concerned about that. When we think about our fungicides going on in our foliar applications, especially on soybeans and corn as well, for the most part, the majority of that product is going to end up being taken up by the plant, end up on that leaf tissue, things like that. When we go out and apply fungicide, at that point, for the most part, that crop is canopied as well. So a lot of the fungicide is probably not going to be making it to the ground where a lot of those beneficial fungi are living. And not to mention, you have a lot of them still living below that soil surface. So the drastic supply of beneficial fungi in the soil, it's going to be pretty hard to have a significant impact on those, especially when most of our product is already ending up on the in the foliar, the leaves of the plants and being taken up by that plant.
Thank you. The next question is referencing the hail damage response on corn. We visually got to see it. What type of yield response did you see off that?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't think they actually took that to yield. If they did, I haven't seen the numbers from that. So that's a great question. I really do wish I had the answer to that, but unfortunately don't have that information.
So the next question is, please address the new fungicide group. And then also, how do we kind of work with, if we do spray fungicides with the lack of disease, for the risk of resistance?
So first of all, to answer that first part, not sure specifically what new group of fungicides we're talking about. If it's the SDHIs that I referred to earlier, it's kind of like I mentioned, they tend to be a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of what they offer and what benefits they offer. For the most part, we find that they bring one specific really good benefit to the table. So it might be really good disease control of one specific disease, or it might be something that helps with mobility throughout the plant, or it could be a combination of different, secondary benefits as well. So that's a good conversation to have with your chemical rep in terms of what that SDHI offers, what it's really good at, maybe what are some of the drawbacks of it as well. So they don't really fall into a specific role, kind of like the strobilurins and the triazoles do. They can kind of have a variety of different benefits. In terms of the resistance management and things like that, it's a really good question. It's something that we should always keep in mind. Probably the biggest problem is that in terms of our row crop fungicides such as corn and soybeans, most of them are going to fall within like that triazole or that strobilurin group or some SDHIs. So it's never going to hurt to mix up some different fungicide options, but the problem is that we don't really get away from those three same groups. So it's not necessarily switching modes of action. But the good thing is that for the most part, we usually don't see resistance issues in our corn and soybeans because primarily we only go out with one fungicide application a year. Where we do tend to see resistance issues be more significant are some of the more specialty crops where you've got multiple fungicide applications going out every single year and there's only so many options that they can choose from. That can lead to higher selection pressure and more of that resistance starting to develop. So it's not something that we see as significantly in corn and soybeans as we do some of those specialty crops, but it is something we do still see. An example of that would be strobilurin resistant frog eye leaf spot, which is becoming more and more of an issue every year, even in Illinois. So if you do have an issue such as that, make sure you're, again, learning about the fungicide that you're using. Make sure it's not relying on only strobilurin to control frog eye leaf spot. In case you do have resistance, then you're probably going to have issues with control.
Thank you. Most recommendations are to spray soybeans R3 or R4 to protect the pod fill. There's been some movement to want to push back a little bit to protect the quote R4.5. What's your thoughts on timing of applications, as well as how much residual would we get out of a particular product?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there definitely has been some interest in moving that fungicide application back and making sure we get good protection through that grain fill. I still want to see those applications go out at R3 or late R3 verging on R4 because I want to make sure that we're getting these fungicides out prior to disease setting in and prior to a pretty important, part of the plant's life cycle, and that's that R4, that grain fill. If we go out and we try to wait a little bit later, there is the potential that we wait too long and we actually allow those diseases to get set in, which could set us back already. So I think foundationally, you want to start out with that R3 application. There are instances we've found in some different studies and trials that we've done in the past couple of years where we have really high yield potential going into that application where we have gone out with a follow-up application at R5. And in the right scenario, we have found that can be add another extra benefit in there on top of what you get with the R3. But what we've also found is that you don't get that same benefit at R5 if you didn't first go out with an application at R3. So it's kind of like you have to build the foundation before you can expand on that. I don't think it's something that you want to religiously do every year. That R5 application, if it's something you're interested in, I think the best situation to try that is where you're very confident in terms of your yield potential. You're getting the right environmental conditions that are going to really drive that yield and lead to a good response from your fungicide. In terms of the residual control that we get, for the most part, we typically expect control for 2 weeks, maybe a little longer at most fungicides that we have today. BASF's got a couple of new fungicides, Stomata and Reactive. I mentioned those earlier that actually have drastically increased that residual disease control for a few weeks longer. So that's something that we're still learning a lot more about, but it's pretty exciting to see how long we're able to control those diseases.
Okay, thank you. The next one is revolving around tank mixing an insecticide with a fungicide. Seems like as we add the insecticide with it, we're getting a synergistic effect. What's your thoughts on that combination?
In soybeans, I always want to see an insecticide in there with a fungicide. For the benefits that we are getting out of it, I think it's a no-brainer in my opinion. And that late insect pressure can have some pretty detrimental effects if we're not protecting. From what we have found, we've not found that it's necessarily a synergistic effect, but more of an additive effect. So you get a 3-bushel response or a 5-bushel response from a fungicide plus an insecticide, and 4 of that may be coming from the fungicide, and 1 of that may be coming from the insecticide. So it's kind of a 4 + 1 = 5, but still the benefits are definitely there. So especially in soybeans, I never recommend a fungicide without throwing an insecticide in there.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That kind of concludes our questions. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude our webinar on why plant health is more than just diseases. Special thanks to our sponsors today, BASF and Mike, for putting together this educational presentation. Our next LSO Advisor webinar will be on July 14th, and you can register for that event or view the recordings of this presentation or other agronomic soybean topics on the checkoff funded website, lsoadvisor.com. With that, thank you for attending and have a great day.